Hello, here's what's coming up on The World Today. Federal prosecutors filed tax charges against U.S. President's son, Hunter Biden. South Africa intercepts 133 suspected trafficking victims. Plus. Hello and a warm welcome to the program. I'm Millicent Walker in Lagos. We begin in the United States, where the Deputy Secretary of State nominee, Kurt Campbell, sounded an alarm on North Korea, saying the reclusive nation was continuing to sharpen its ability to fire long-range weapons and showed no interest in diplomatic solutions to its standoff with the West. Mr. Campbell made his remarks at a Senate confirmation hearing at which he was drilled with questions about Russia, China, and North Korea. During the hearing, Mr. Campbell also said he was confident that China will be unsuccessful in building the kind of bonds of trust with South Korea and Japan, whose thawing relations, he said, will be crucial to the security of the Indo-Pacific region.
But it is also the case, I also believe, that fundamentally our long-term interests over the remainder of this century will play out largely in the Indo-Pacific, and there is the real risk of strategic surprise. And there are countries that are testing us, looking to see if we're preoccupied. And I want to just commit to you today, if confirmed, I will do everything possible working within the United States government to make sure that we are not tested and that we stand ready to respond to any challenges to our power, to our allies in the Indo-Pacific more directly. But I will also say December 7th teaches us other things as well, and that is the redemptive power of democracy. I would contend with you that our most important ally and partner on the global stage today might be Japan. We've done a remarkable amount of things from the rubble of that. That's got to give us hope as we persevere in a variety of places around the globe. We've had difficulty getting any takers, even in addressing our letters or approaches to them. I do think this is something that requires deeper consultations with allies and partners. I'm concerned that North Korea has taken very dangerous steps with respect to Russia providing military equipment to Russia's campaign. I'm concerned that North Korea continues to perfect its long-range missile and nuclear capabilities in ways that are antithetical not only to the region but to the United States as well. And so, to be honest, I share your concerns. I am worried that North Korea in the current environment has decided that they are no longer interested in diplomacy with the United States. And that means that we're going to have to focus even more on deterrence. Concern them. The thing that I think they recognize has the potential, the most significance in changing the security architecture of Asia is if Japan and South Korea can finally and fundamentally put their animosity behind them to focus on the future in everything: energy, technology, security, people-to-people education. This is our goal. I do want to also just say it is in our interest to commend more publicly the risks and the courage that have been shown by Japan and South Korea. They need to recognize that we fully support at every possible level what they've done, and we seek to strengthen it as it goes forward. Excellent. And I'm confident that China will be unsuccessful in building the kind of bonds of trust that we are doing now with Japan and South Korea.
Indeed.
Staying in the United States, the Department of Justice has filed new criminal charges against the son of U.S. President Hunter Biden, accusing him of failing to pay $1.4 million in taxes from 2016 to 2019. The 53-year-old was hit with 3 felony and 6 misdemeanor tax offenses, and that's according to an indictment filed in the U.S. District Court, the Central District of California. The Justice Department said its investigation into Hunter Biden is ongoing, adding that he faces up to 17 years in prison if convicted. Hunter Biden was first indicted in September on federal firearm charges in Delaware. The White House has not yet commented on this. However, his lawyer has said the new charges are politically motivated. And the European Union and China held their first face-to-face summit since before the pandemic yesterday. EU leaders Ursula von der Leyen and Charles Michel travelled to Beijing for talks with Chinese President Xi Jinping. European Council President Charles Michel said China and the European Union need to make their trade and economic relationship more reciprocal and balanced, adding that the EU expects China to take more concrete actions to increase market access for foreign companies. The EU-China relationship has grown increasingly rocky in recent years, with geopolitical tensions heightened by differences over human rights, the war in Ukraine, and the EU's bid to diversify its trade.
Politically, European leaders will not be able to tolerate that our industrial base is undermined by unfair competition. We like competition. It makes us better, it lowers prices, it's good for the consumers, but competition needs to be fair. China, by the way, had a long-standing similar approach. China called it self-reliance, and it was partially included in the dual circulatory approach. I want to be very clear here too. Europe does not want to decouple from China. We have seen a decoupling Europe from Russia for good reasons. We do not want a decoupling from China.
As we speak, Russia continues to illegally attack Ukraine, and you know that we strongly support the people of Ukraine. This includes Ukraine's future in our European Union. As a permanent member of the UN Security Council, China, in our opinion, has a special responsibility because this Russian war threatens global stability and the world economy. And it also affects the most vulnerable around the world, for instance, by increasing food insecurity and driving up commodity prices. This is not in Europe's interest, this is not in China's interest, this is not in the world's interest. And that's why we strongly encourage China to engage constructively on Ukraine's peace formula. Russia continues to look for ways to access technology to power its war. And once again, we insisted that China should not supply military goods to Russia. And we reiterated how important it is that China help to prevent Russia from circumventing sanctions.
Well, for more on this, I'm now being joined by Deutsche Welle correspondent Marie Sinner in Berlin. Marie, what more was discussed at the meeting?
Right, so as you mentioned, trade was the big talking point here. The EU is running a 400 billion euro trade deficit with China, so their economic relationship is very uneven, and both sides agreed that their trade relationship should be more balanced. And both sides discussed the root causes of their trade imbalance. For the EU, the thorniest issue that they addressed were that they feel European companies are at a disadvantage in China. In the EU's eyes, there is a lack of access to the Chinese market because of trade barriers and because of preferential treatments of Chinese firms in China through heavy subsidies, for example. Beijing, on the other hand, also aired its concerns. It said that it expects prudence when it comes to restrictive trade policies of Brussels. It referred to the investigation that Brussels launched into Chinese subsidies for electric vehicles, and China sees that investigation as protectionism. Now, next to trade, another big topic were the ties between China and Russia. Leading up to the summit, the EU said that they want to urge Xi Jinping to stop Chinese companies from exporting European dual-use items to Russia. Dual-use items mean products that could also be used in warfare by Russia. But on that point, there didn't seem to be any movement. There was no joint statement. And the talks also didn't end with a communique or a joint press conference. So there still really wasn't much proximity between both sides.
But how do these talks fit into the EU's relationship with China more broadly?
Right, so this was the first in-person meeting since before the pandemic, as you mentioned, so symbolically very important, and it comes at a time when Europe has been racing to reduce its economic dependence on China. For example, it's been trying to limit its imports from China by looking into domestic sources of rare earth metals, and EU officials always sum up this strategy with their favorite buzzword, which is de-risking. It essentially is an attempt to make Europe less vulnerable to China while keeping trade intact. But at the same time, China's trade with the EU reached record levels last year, and Chinese firms remain by far the largest supplier of goods to Europe. So there's definitely still a lot of dependence despite this big European strategy. Now, this meeting is also happening within a tense context of the war in Ukraine, and the biggest political bone of contention between the two sides is the fact that China says it wants peace between Ukraine and Russia, but it has stuck by Moscow's side as an ally, and the EU wants China to use its influence with Russia to end the invasion, and so far China hasn't done that, and that's caused a lot of tension between the two sides in the past years.
So what can we expect from both sides going forward?
Right, so this meeting was the final opportunity for both sides to meet in person before the European Parliament elections begin next year. So that's a change in Europe's leadership. So it was really a way to set the tone, but really it remains at just setting the tone. It would be wrong to expect a fundamental economic and political change after the summit, because it was really more about preventing a descent into confrontation between the EU and China and letting both sides vent their differences rather than finding true common ground.
Thanks, Marie. Marie Sinner, Deutsche Welle correspondent for us live there in Berlin. Let's head to Africa now, where police in South Africa have intercepted 133 people suspected to be victims of human trafficking. This is the third of such incidents that occurred at the country's northeastern province of Limpopo. According to the police, the victims, which included both children and adults, were transported in 10 minibus taxis. Spokesperson for the province says role players, including Home Affairs, have been summoned to investigate the situation, adding that in most likely cases, the victims are going to be deported back to their border. Similarly, in a separate operation in Gauteng province, police also announced the rescue of 33 human trafficking victims. Meanwhile, at least 3 people have died in Seychelles after heavy rains caused flooding on the island. Homes and roads in the main Seychelles island of Mahé were destroyed as boulders, debris and earth was displaced. According to state broadcaster, 2 of them died when a big boulder flattened their homes at Lenioli. The third was dragged downriver by strong currents at Belombre. President Wavo Ramkalawan has declared a state of emergency after a blast in another part of the area as explosives wrecked buildings and caused massive damage to an industrial zone. The government has also set up a disaster relief fund after Thursday's explosion. The Indian Ocean island nation of East Africa is a major tourist destination made up of 115 islands, and is the least populous country in Africa with about 100,000 people. Persistent droughts in Tunisia have slowed down economic growth, leading to a slight increase in the second quarter of 2023 to 15.6% compared to 15.3% last year. 4 years of drought have dried up Tunisian reservoirs, threatening harvests that are critical to the country's battered economy. Farm owners find themselves grappling with the climate change-induced drought. Take a look.
Tunisia farmer Mohamed Hamami holds dry pomegranates in his hands while standing in his drought-hit farm in northern Tunisia's Testour town. The 74-year-old farmer says he's never witnessed a drought this bad, adding that while previously the country had witnessed a few days of severe heat at a time, this year it's been hot for months.
I am 74 years old and I have never seen drought and heat like this before. Previously, there would be 3 or 4 days of high temperature and then it cools down. However, now temperature has been the same since June with intense heat.
Inadequate rainfall and scorching heat have left the water levels at the Sidi El Barek Dam in the town of Nafsa, 140 kilometers west of Tunis, very low, and the land surrounding it cracked and dry. The dam's water reserves are only at 22% of its total capacity as of mid-November, according to the Tunisian Agricultural Ministry.
At the start of this agricultural season, there are significant concerns about the possibility of a drought year. If another drought season occurs, we will face many problems because we don't have enough water to irrigate grain crops, spanning approximately 1,000 acres across 3 or 4 states. This lack of self-sufficiency in our food production poses a risk for what we will eat or cultivate in the coming year.
Earlier this year, the country announced it was cutting off water supplies to citizens for 7 hours a night due to the drought. The Agriculture Ministry has also banned the use of potable water to wash cars, water green areas and clean streets and public places. Violators face a fine and imprisonment for a period of between 6 days to 6 months.
Welcome back. The UK government has published new legislation with a further £100 million, which it says addresses the UK Supreme Court's concerns about the legality of sending asylum seekers to Rwanda. Home Secretary James Cleverly has also signed a new treaty with the East African country, which he says will strengthen its asylum process. In November, the court ruled that the Rwanda scheme was unlawful because the risk that asylum seekers sent there could end up in countries where they could face harm. The government says that the bill makes clear in UK law that Rwanda is a safe country for asylum seekers. The new legislation, which must be approved by Parliament, would order British judges and courts to ignore some sections of the UK Human Rights Act. Well, for more on the implications of this, we have joining us Steve Valdez-Simmons, Amnesty International UK's Refugee and Migrant Rights Director. Thanks so much for joining us. In light of this new legislation and deal with Rwanda, what concerns does Amnesty International have? And this is regarding the potential violations of human rights and international obligations.
There are so many concerns with what is happening right now of precisely the type you ask. I mean, obviously, an immediate concern relates to anybody who may be subjected to this legislation, who has made a legitimate claim for asylum in this country, the UK, who ought to get on and deal with their claim and decide whether they are entitled to asylum here or not, just like this country expects other countries to do. And the risk that they may be expelled to Rwanda and not receive any fair process of their claim, and indeed be at risk of mistreatment there or expulsion or pressure to leave and find themselves harmed elsewhere. But the concerns here go much, much further. The extraordinary thing that is happening now is the government has seen the conclusion of our highest courts, our Supreme Court, on all the evidence the government put in front of it, that Rwanda is not safe. And what the government has chosen to do is, apart from secure this new treaty with Rwanda, which it says will change that circumstance, is to now seek legislation from our parliament that will require the finding of the Supreme Court to be utterly ignored and reversed in practice, and refuse to allow any court in this country, or anyone else for that matter, to question the idea that Rwanda may not be safe, whatever the evidence may show. Now, the idea that Parliament can make laws that determine facts undermines any principle of human rights.
But the thing is, who do we believe here? Because the British government is arguing and putting an argument that Rwanda is a safe country for asylum seekers under UK law. But let's talk about the bill that allows migrants to challenge their removal to Rwanda, and this is with regards to specific grounds. How effective do you believe that provision will be in protecting these individuals, from being sent there, or, sent there where they may face serious harm?
Well, the bill sets out to not protect them. It very deliberately sets out to do that, because what it says is that no court can consider the evidence of the question our Supreme Court decided and come to the same conclusion as our Supreme Court has come. Doesn't matter what the evidence is. That conclusion is not available. No court in this country would be allowed, if this bill is passed and if it is legitimate, to find that someone sent to Rwanda was at risk of ending up somewhere where they would be persecuted. Now, that's just extraordinary. So,
I was just going to say, what do you make of the other angle on the side, the argument on the British side about the policy that is to deter people from crossing the English Channel in small boats, and that's a lot of risk for these individuals as well?
I think that's all nonsense by ministers. The fact is that long before this agreement with Rwanda, the first one in April last year, was ever made, this country set itself, its government set itself on a course of trying to refuse to determine the asylum claims of people who come here seeking asylum. We don't receive that many compared to other European countries, and we receive even fewer people compared to many much poorer countries around the world. But nonetheless, our government set out to simply say, well, we won't deal with anyone's claims, no matter that they're here. And the only way of even pretending that that can work is to try and persuade some other country to accept the refugees who have come here. But Rwanda's not going to receive tens of thousands of people. It has its own refugee population to address, and it probably needs some assistance to do that. This country should stand up and deal with its responsibilities and stop expecting that others take responsibilities that it refuses. And unless and until it does so, we're just going to be in more and more of a mess here, and unfortunately, possibly elsewhere.
So in your estimation, what do you think the main aim of the British government is with regards to this? And, you know, this is also looking at other sort of migration laws that it has come out with, the 5-point plan and others. Do you see a trajectory where it's moving to in terms of, you know, migration and then asylum seekers as well?
This government is very clearly on a path of simply refusing to abide by its obligations to people who seek asylum, to basically rip up the Refugee Convention that this country was one of the first, very first, to sign. But it's worse than that, because the way this government is now constructing law is a way essentially of ripping up everybody's human rights, or even just any legal rights at all, if the government doesn't like them, doesn't like their rights, and doesn't like being held to account in a courtroom. That's tremendously dangerous for absolutely anyone and everyone in this country, whether they're seeking asylum here, whether they're a migrant here, or whether they're a citizen here. And it really needs to be stopped.
Do you think that they will be stopped? The government seems adamant, and, you know, they continue the pursuit of this policy. What do you think will happen if this goes ahead as planned, and that's if the courts, the final courts, sanctions it?
I find it very difficult to believe that at some point this is not going to have to explode in an absolute crisis in this country. And the question is, will that crisis happen sooner rather than later? Because the sooner it happens, the smaller actually it will be. So hopefully our parliament will refuse to pass this law. It certainly shouldn't be in the business of trying to pass laws that determine what the facts are. That's not its job. If it does so, our courts should certainly refuse to apply this law, because Parliament has no authority to tell them what the facts are. It only has authorities to make the law. And if our courts feel that they cannot or do not do so, then this country is going to end up in front of the European Court on Human Rights. And I've no doubt that it will have to tell this country, not to mention many other UN bodies responsible for other international agreements that relate to all of this, will have to tell this country that it is completely out with international law and the agreements by which it is bound. So goodness knows where this ends up, but the sooner it is dealt with, this horrible boil is last, the better for everybody.
Steve, again, what other role will Amnesty International be playing here? And this is also when the government comes and says they're also having problems. These are issues. We need to also deal with these issues, and this is how we think, we can solve this.
Well, Amnesty wrote to the government within days of it initiating the policy that has led to all of this. That policy began in December 2020. We said to the government, if you pursue this effort as simply refusing to process people's claims, you will wreck your asylum system. It will break down. You will have an enormous and growing backlog of people stuck in a system in limbo whom you will have to pay to support. And of course, you will do a lot of enormous human misery while you're at it. And all of that has happened. Unfortunately, the government keeps doubling down. It refuses to admit that it has made an absolutely awful fundamental error of judgment. And so now we have this deal with Rwanda, and now we have this very dangerous legislation put to Parliament. At some point, this will have to end. Someone will have to take responsibility. Amnesty's job, first and foremost, is to make sure we do all we can to ensure that everyone can understand just what a dangerous thing the government is doing and how ridiculously recklessly it is behaving, because all it needs to do is to do precisely what it demands of other countries. Deal with the asylum claims it receives. Work out who is entitled to asylum here and grant it. And if there are people who make claims who are not entitled to asylum, then if they can be safely returned to their home countries, then that may be done.
All right. Amnesty International UK's Refugee Migrant Rights Director, Steve Valdez-Simmons, thanks for your time. We continue to see where this gets to in the coming days. Thanks again.
Thank you.
Russia's invasion of Ukraine now, British Foreign Secretary David Cameron has urged politicians in the United States to approve a fresh package of military aid for Ukraine. And this comes after US President Joe Biden pleaded with Republicans for a fresh infusion of military aid for Ukraine, warning that a victory for Russia over Kyiv would leave Moscow in a position to attack NATO allies and could draw US troops into a war. However, Senate Republicans on Wednesday blocked Democratic-backed legislation that would have provided billions of dollars in new security assistance for Ukraine, saying they wanted to press their point about the importance of tighter border policy.
Putin's invasion of Ukraine was the worst example of one state invading and wrecking the sovereignty of another state that we have seen since the Second World War. And it is a huge challenge to us. I'm not worried about the strength and unity and consensus and bravery of the Ukrainian people. I've been there, I've seen it for myself. I'm worried that we're not going to do what we need to do. Add up the economies of the countries that are on the side of Ukraine. We outmatch Russia by 30 to 1 in terms of the size of our economies, the size of our GDPs. We've just got to make that size count. And we've got to make sure we give them the weapons, the economic support, the moral support, the diplomatic support, but crucially that military support that can make a difference. Now, the second thing you hear is Europe pulling its weight? Isn't this all the US, and are we doing enough? What you are doing an incredible job, the weapons you supply, the economic support you give, but the figures now show that actually European countries are doing, if you add up the economic support and the military support, are doing twice as much as the United States. So the support really is there. And if you vote through this package, however you do it and whatever you have to connect it with in Congress, it will give an enormous fillip to those European countries.
Well, following the Russian invasion of Ukraine in February 2022, Operation Interflex, a training program for Ukrainian forces, began in June 2022 with support from the UK and partner nations. Training 32,000 Ukrainians so far, it's said to be the largest initiative of its kind on British soil since World War II. Channels Television was granted access to one of the training camps in southern England, offering a first-hand look at the soldiers in training. Our London correspondent, Teniola Tayo, reports.
This is just one of several locations across the UK where Ukrainian men and women are being trained to resist Russia's invasion. Many of them, only a few weeks prior, worked in various civilian professions.
It's not as cold as it is in Ukraine, in the UK right now, but these new Ukrainian recruits are getting their first taste and experience of what it feels like to be on the front line as they prepare to head to war.
Codenamed Operation Interflex, in the space of just 5 weeks, they are taught essential skills required to survive and be effective in frontline combat. Training includes live firing, battlefield first aid, operational law, and tactics.
For our basic course, we only have 5 weeks to take somebody from a raw recruit, a civilian, perhaps with, in most cases, with no military experience or very limited military experience, to within a 5-week window to be good enough to be on the battlefield and to be better than their Russian foe.
The course is intelligence-driven, continually evolving to meet the latest operational needs. Experienced soldiers also undergo training to serve as instructors, imparting the acquired tactics back in Ukraine.
I've trained guys that have fought in the Donbass region in the trenches, and then they've come up and they've trained them. And we've enhanced their capability with what we can pass and provide them over. So we've given them our tactics, we've given them some skill sets that we've got that they've not necessarily learned or been shown before. And they can take that back to Ukraine and train their soldiers now to a slightly higher level than what they already are at, which would give them that survivability and give them that lethality.
Despite his injuries, this Ukrainian soldier is determined to return to the front line.
Well, first of all, if I will not join the army, who will? All of us, all men, we need to join army and to fight for our country. So many of us who were injured, we are not intended just to escape from all of this. Conversely, we try to stay in army as long as possible, to take part in the missions, or at least to help to train the conscripts and soldiers. Well, I can't afford, I was wounded, but I can't afford just go back home and to do nothing once my mates are dying.
Operation Interflex has seen significant participation, with over 32,000 recruits trained in the UK since June 2022. It's an international effort that involves hundreds of military personnel, not just from the UK, but Australia, New Zealand, Canada, and 6 other nations.
From an Australian perspective, it's very important, the work that we're doing here. We understand that the invasion of Ukraine was illegal, it was unprovoked, and it's very important for them to be able to preserve their sovereignty as an independent country and make the decisions that matter to them, essentially preserving their democracy.
In addition to extensive training, the UK provides ongoing support to Ukraine, supplying long-range missiles, battle tanks, and logistical aid to push back Russian forces. As the war grinds on, the UK government says it's prepared to continue this support for as long as necessary. From southern England, Teniola Tayo for Channels Television News.
And finally on the program, a fashion show has held in the Russian city of Kaliningrad. The Kaliningrad Amber Factory Russia Soul Amber Enterprise showcased its first creative workshop for Russian fashion designers, with a focus on using the organic gemstone as bold additions to clothing designs for everyday wear and special occasions. Models struck through on runway wearing amber-themed clothes and accessories. In the experimental samples, the amber is presented independently or as essential items or classic textures such as buttons or embroidery. In a daring move, the collection also includes a double-breasted men's suit with a jacket, lapel, and star details designed for fashion-forward men looking to make a statement. The Kaliningrad Amber Factory is the only full-cycle amber enterprise in Russia and the largest in the world. The production spans from mining raw amber to manufacturing jewelry and souvenirs. That's the world today, this Friday. Thank you for watching. I'm Millicent Walker.